Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Before we go into the Torah service, Becca and I will spend a few moments in conversation. Becca has to go later to the family service to be with the parents and the kids. And so we're going to do now a short, but hopefully somewhat meaningful conversation about a remarkable article, an essay by the late Israeli Rabbi Rav Shagar, whom we discussed here a number of times over the last few years. Rav Shagar was a founder of a yeshiva called Siach Yitzhak, and he was an incredible thinker and philosopher, and he read classical Jewish texts, Talmud, Kabbalah, and Hasidism through the lens of contemporary philosophy, in particular of postmodernism.
Yeah.
And he has some incredible articles and essays and books, and many of them pretty difficult and deep. And there is an essay.
And just to add also that in his lifetime that he wasn't looked upon well from other rabbis. He took a lot of slack from other people in terms of his ideas, his thoughts. Some people even thought he was heretical in some of his teachings, which they're very beautiful and powerful, and that sometimes he pushes against the boundaries, very much so, especially in modern Israel.
Exactly. And he has an essay called The Haggadah as a Foundational Story. And Becca and I have been looking at this text and having conversation over it. So we'd like to share with you a few passages and comment, bring our own thoughts to it, and hopefully it will give some foundation for the Seder tonight.
Beautiful.
So just read a couple of sections that we've marked and we'll comment. And he says that the Haggadah and the telling of the story is about the presence of the past in the present. We're not just telling what happened in the past. We're repeating the past in the present, a repetition that is expressed in the fact that every person must see themselves as if they had come out of Mitzrayim, in eating the matzot and the maror, in the complete experience that the night creates. And so the telling of the story is, the Haggadah is a foundational story, the foundational narrative of the Jewish people. It says that narrative psychology recognizes that every person has a narrative. The way in which they tell their own past, the way in which they understand which events in their life have shaped them. Of course, this narrative is completely a subjective matter, since the person chooses the events that they tell about their life selectively. We all do that. Ask yourself, or somebody asks you, what's your story? You choose specific events in your life that you think have marked you, have shaped your character the way you are, or have determined whom you've become. The same is true with this story, which is often engraved in the subconscious. And just like a personal story, this story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is engraved in the collective memory and is what establishes the self-consciousness of the Jewish people as the chosen people who came in covenant with God. It is a memory of a collective self that precedes the individual self. Memory of a collective self that precedes the individual self. We were there. This memory is engraved in a deeper foundation and inherits a whole range of Jewish perceptions and ways of thinking that are engraved in us.
It's beautiful. It's, I think, two pieces of what he does here, going back to the first part about the past and the present, and we'll see as he goes through the essay, but he starts to collapse time. And in storytelling, sometimes the chronology of the story actually makes a huge difference, and in other ways there are these common threads that are always there and that are always bringing us through, even from when we're very young or at different points in our life. And so his idea of this subjectivity of storytelling and how we choose to tell our own narrative, but individually, as you were saying, in terms of who am I talking to? How would I choose different moments in my life? I was thinking about where if you were asking versus if my children were asking, or if you're at an interview and somebody's asking, that the audience changes. However, with our story as a collective, that story doesn't necessarily change. That's one difference that I was thinking about as we were reading this, where he says this is our collective story, that this is in our subconscious even before our personal story. It's like such a beautiful, it reminds me of the midrash of the babies getting saved. Like, it's like this is a part of our fabric. And at the same time, that story is actually a constant for us. And that story doesn't necessarily change depending on the audience or who we're with, and how we choose to tell that story.
Well, the story was chosen for us, how it's told. And we retell it and we choose on the choosing. And that's the interesting thing, right? I mean, the story was chosen for us. We are handed a story that is in the Torah, that is in the Haggadah. We're handed this story, and then we sit at the table, and that story, we make it our own by telling it and retelling it and bringing details and bringing commentaries and bringing questions and bringing our own angle. And this year in particular, I think, many of us feel here that the reality is pretty singular. We have not been in a place like this. Certainly our generation has not been in a place like this for a very long time in this country. And I think that I'm sure that we will tell the story tonight with the reality of what's happening now in the background, very much so. Not in the background, the foreground.
It's interesting when you say that it's chosen for us, and yet what we choose to focus on is so dependent on what's happening around us, maybe as a collective, but also individually. Just thinking about if you go through a loss one year, and what will stand out to you from the Haggadah might be very different than something that wouldn't be, but that's part of, I think, what you were also teaching last night, of how do we make something that stays the same, fresh and new. I mean, that's what we try to do all the time with our tradition, but the Haggadah in particular being this narrative story and being a way in which we are also choosing to retell it each year. And then,
And the interesting thing is that the story of the Haggadah is not the story of what happened.
Right.
It's the story of what our ancestors chose to tell us.
Absolutely.
What happened.
And even within the Haggadah, you have differences of that story, of where it's supposed to start. How does it start? We did our teaching and said, do you start with Yaakov? Actually, do we go back to Yosef? How does the story change and shift with where you start? And also even there are questions around the middle and the end of a story too. Like, is a story only about the end? We know there's redemption at the end. Is that what it's all about? Is that the only part that matters in a story? And I think some of that conversation also comes alive here when he starts to ask, what are the things that you're picking? Where do you start? Where do you end? And how does that make a whole other story come alive within it?
He says that the Torah emphasizes the importance of the commandments of remembrance, especially the remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. What is the significance of this remembrance? What experience does it enact in us? The purpose of the experience is to dictate our behavior in the future. How does the Torah create this experience? I mean, the whole purpose of the Seder of Pesach and the whole story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, according to him, is in order to dictate and to shape our behavior in the future. It's not just to remember the past. I mean, that would be a somewhat futile exercise, just to remember the past. It's to remember the past for the sake of the future.
I think it's also, what story do we tell ourselves in who we are as a people and individually? That story, what he's saying is, we craft the narrative. It's subjective. When we choose to tell a story, how do we see ourselves individually? And then when we're telling this Yetziat Mitzrayim, our redemption story, do we see ourselves as the victims? And he's going to talk about this. Do we see ourselves as the ones who came out and are now free? And then no matter what stories we tell ourselves, that's actually impacts who we are in the world. It impacts our relationships. It impacts the way we act toward the people around us, toward ourselves, and then also toward the greater world and those who may be in need or those who are pushing against us. Whatever story it is that we're telling is going to impact. It isn't just past, and this is where he starts to play around with the past and present, where he says we're telling this story, and the Haggadah also pulls us in this way. It's like, are we free? Are we not free? Like, we were slaves. We are slaves. Next year we're going to be free. We're celebrating that freedom. We do Hallel. We're so grateful to be free. It's not so clear as to what the story is.
And permanently in.
Yep.
And permanently coming out. I mean, that's the Jewish consciousness, which he claims. He says the Jewish consciousness is to see yourself in Mitzrayim, in exile, and all the time coming out. Both at the same time, one foot here, one foot there. He says, Vehi she'amda lavotenu velanu, the promise that was made by God to our ancestors and to us. Shelo echad bilvad amad alenu lechalotenu. In every generation, people rise to oppress us and to destroy us. V'akadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu miyadam, and the Holy One rescues us from their hand. So the constant seeing yourself in the threat of the oppression, in the threat of the oppression, in the threat of the destruction, and at the same time living the promise that God will redeem us. That's the Jewish consciousness, living both in the exile and in the redemption, both at the same time. That's an extraordinary, he makes that point, it's an extraordinary point.
Yes.
And I think we can feel it now, here. That we feel that the things is getting narrower and narrower, and our freedoms are now being threatened. People are being picked up from the street. And people are caving in, and people are now, as you saw, law firms and universities are feeling that they have to concede. And there are people fighting, there are people conceding, and things is getting closer and closer. And the promise is, V'akadosh Baruch Hu matzilem miyadam, that we will see ourselves, and we see ourselves with the capacity to transcend the situation and to become free. So we live both in these two realities simultaneously, as you say, the collapse of time and the collapse of, we're not just in one place.
It's interesting because he also says, I'm curious what you make of, he says, we do not remember the past because it happened,
right,
but it happened so that we would remember it.
That's right.
So I'm going to say it again. We don't remember the past because it happened. It happened so that we have the opportunity to remember it.
Aviva Zornberg says it similarly. We don't tell the story because it happened. It happened so that we may tell the story. In other words, it's so foundational that the story happened so that we may tell it, not the other way around, so that we will have it in our consciousness, constantly live with it. And what we do tonight is reaffirming each year over and over, reaffirming this story as part of the fabric of who we are. Not just physically, we are here because our ancestors were freed from Mitzrayim, but we are in the metaphysical consciousness of the Jewish, in the collective memory of the Jewish people.
And it's not
we
just
reaffirm it year after year.
It's also not just tonight. It's every single day in our tefillah. Twice in Shacharit, we cross the sea. We get to that part right before we start. At the end of Psukei de Zimra, we do the Shirat Hayam. Sometimes we don't always do it in our minyan, but that part of the service right before Shacharit brings us up to the edge of the splitting of the sea. And then right before the Amidah, the Tzor Yisrael part, we go back into that consciousness of what is it to be a people that's standing at the edge of the sea. That's twice in Shacharit, and then again in Arabit in the evening.
Before we have crossed, yeah.
Before we've crossed. It's like we're always 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And the fact of saying that it happens, that we're constantly living in that it's not past, but it's the driver of the way we are in the world today. And I think what he gets at later on in the essay too, of then he starts to ask, so what do you do with power? What happens when you are one in power?
There are two things, at least two lessons of this remembrance of your seeing the self this way. One, he says, is the feeling of grace, the grace of existence. If not for the grace of God, we wouldn't be where we are. That we live always in the possibility that we might not be. We live always in the possibility that we might not be free. You know, there's always that hanging there, and it's by the grace of God that we are who we are and we live how we live. And the second implication of this memory is how we treat others and how we treat the poor and how we treat the oppressed. And that's the whole purpose of this remembrance, according to him.
Yeah. And
But that's part of the consciousness of the Jewish people. It's also always to have the sensitivity and the regard for those who are oppressed.
And he even says here, he talks a little bit about this idea of both the present as being a time of redemption, but that also the present as a time of hope.
Yes.
That even when you may be in a place of feeling oppressed or having power or having both of them, that hope is actually power. Hope itself can be an act of power in a time when you are being oppressed or when you are the victim or see yourself as the victim. But he cautions us against saying, don't only see yourself as a victim, to say, and it's a little bit like your Toward Shabbat, I'm in fear, all I can think about is myself. He says it's the opposite of that. It's take that hope, take that feeling, and also make sure that nobody else in the world ever has to feel that way.
So how do we awaken hope in a year like this, in a world like this, tonight? And I think the Haggadah gives you the sense that there's a possibility. There's a possibility. If they got freed from Mitzrayim, in the situation in which they were, that somehow God's grace and God's help and God's power, if we seize it, if we see the opening, if we seize the opening and we go through out of the narrow place into the expanse, that there is a chance for us and there's a chance for the world. But we have to seize it. So the celebration of tonight has to inspire a sense of God's grace and God's power, a liberating power, a sense of empathy and sympathy for those who are oppressed, and a sense of hope and a sense of possibility. But we have to act, we have to rise, and we have to go from the narrow place to the expanse. And we hope everybody will have meaningful Sdarim tonight, and if you celebrate also tomorrow, that it will open something in us, give us strength, give us light and hope as we connect with this foundational story.
And that it'll help us also retell the story in new ways.